welcome in from the rain and the sun and the rainbows and a beautiful summer evening. I am Laurie Norton Moffat, Director and CEO of Norman Rockwell Museum, and this is really an historic moment tonight. We are delighted to welcome so many of our artists, our collectors, patrons, lenders, and our museum members and friends and guests here tonight. I ask you what's been asked of me thousands of times. Is illustration art? What is the difference between an artist and an illustrator? In this age of instant imaging, have former lines of distinction between fine and commercial art been blurred in the face of ubiquitous visual information? Has contemporary realism come of age as a reflection of its time? What is the role of art in making citizens? And how does art communicate our values as a nation? Why was Rockwell, so beloved by his public, rebuked by the art world? Is there still discomfort with Rockwell in the art world? And what is the relationship of commercial work, design, illustration, to social and political issues? And that ever popular question, can popular or commercially successful art and an artist be any good? Can an artwork that tells a story and does not need critical interpretation be important? And how do we come to reevaluate an artist's reputation? These are just some of the pressing questions explored in our summer exhibition, Rockwell and Realism in an Abstract World. In the 1950s, there was heated debate about the relative merits of abstract art, realist art, and popular illustration, and Norman Rockwell was frequently caught in the crossfire. Rockwell was the symbolic artist against whom much of the art world turned, in large measure due to influential art critic Clement Greenberg spurning his sentimental realist images as kitsch. Rockwell even tried his own hand at abstract modernism in his Jackson Pollock-styled painting, The Connoisseur, featured on rare view in this exhibition on loan from a private collection. The exhibition explores this rebellious turning point in American art when many artists rejected Rockwell's version of realism and invented non-representational artistic vocabulary. Many narrative painters who came of age in the 1970s have told me of needing to hide their admiration of Rockwell's art from their professors, lest they be kicked out of art school for not being serious artists. In our exhibition this summer, you will view many artists who followed their passion and carried forward the realist tradition through the latter half of the 20th century right into the present day. And Rockwell was irrefutably successful by any measure of his public popularity, longevity, commercial success, and mass appeal, yet often viewed as an artistic failure in the eyes of the art world. Why then did so many rebel against him, and how did he persevere in the face of such crushing criticism? And let me just share with you a few of the comments art critics have had to say about Norman Rockwell's work over the past 50 to 60 years. Clement Greenberg, the great champion of abstract expressionism, relegated Rockwell with kitsch, thus condemning him to critical shame for the latter half of the 20th century. His success was his failure, wrote Arthur Danto, art critic and Columbia University professor, to close his 1986 New York Times book review of Norman Rockwell's catalog raisonné. The Rembrandt of Pumpkin Creek, wrote John Cannaday, art critic of the New York Times, in his 1972 review of the Brooklyn Museum Rockwell Retrospective, the first major Rockwell show to tour this nation. 6 years later, Cannaday wrote an amiable anachronism in Rockwell's New York Times obituary in 1978. Grace Gluck of the Times referred to Rockwell as the corny but cherished American illustrator, and Deborah Solomon, one of Rockwell's biographers and critic of the Times, among other journals, reminisced in her article In Praise of Bad Art in 1999 of the time when art history professors, if they spoke of Rockwell at all, spoke of him with sneering disdain. And she and I both had earned our art history degrees at the same time, and I can attest to that attitude. Paul Richard of the Washington Post referred to him as an American master. Seriously, he had to note in the headline, noting how Rockwell was stiffed by the art world, who shuns him still. That was in also 99. John Updike wrote, "He is widely loved like no other painter in America, yet despised in high art circles, he pushed on into canvases that almost transcend their folksy, crowd-pleasing subjects." And Paul Johnson, the British author of A History of the American People, wrote in Spectator, 20 years after his death, that's quote, 20 years after Rockwell's death, his work is still beginning to strike permanent roots. And Johnson predicts that Rockwell will be ranked among the old masters, as he is already firmly wedged in humble hearts and minds. Robert Hughes, in his epic History of Art in America, referred to Rockwell's depthless narrative clarity. Hughes memorialized in his Time magazine obituary on Rockwell, "He never made an impression on the history of art and never will." But on the history of illustration and mass communication, his mark was deep and will remain indelible. But we're seeing the tide turn. Thanks in part to the work of this museum and many others, in the 20th century, the tide begins to turn and realism is creeping back into fashion. But as you will see in this exhibition, it never fully went out of fashion. It just hid a while underground. Robert Rosenblum wrote in his book forum review of Carol Ann Marling's Rockwell monograph for the National Museum of American Art, "I, for one, am happy now to love Rockwell for his own sake." And Paul Johnson continued, "Critics dismissed Rockwell for the usual trade union reasons. They have nothing to say about pictures which explain themselves. Rockwell gave them no mediatory function." This is the first exhibition by our museum to explore this mid-century flexion point that led Rockwell to fall out of critical favor, only to emerge in recent times as the American artist whose work has set the auction records for American art, with a $46 million painting sale a couple of years ago. I'd like to express our sincere thanks to TD Bank for their generous support of Rockwell and realism in an abstract world, and I know there are representatives here tonight. If you can see me, please wave or stand. Thank you so much for making the show possible. And we are also immensely grateful to our lenders, without whom the exhibition would not be possible, because we don't own all these works of abstract and various realist artists. These among them include the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Brooklyn Museum, Boca Raton Museum of Art, Sheldon Museum of Art, the Society of Illustrators Museum of American Illustration, the estate of Roy Lichtenstein, Jane Eckert Fine Art, Betty Cunningham Gallery, the Pace Gallery, PPOW Gallery, the Illustrated Gallery, Universal Limited Art Editions, the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, Seven Bridges Foundation, Ellen and Leslie Kober, Lynn Kircher and Carl Chait, John V. Frank, and Sandy and George Garfunkel, plus Andrew Nelson, Phyllis and Jamie Wyeth, and several collectors who wish to remain private. And I have to thank our staff who pulled all those loans together and transported them here from all over the country to put this show together. And I'd like too to mention the artists who are among us today and who are represented in the exhibition as realists of today's styles. Marshall Erisman, from whom we'll hear shortly, the family of Alan E. Kober, Eric Forstman, Tim O'Brien, welcome Tim, president of the Society of Illustrators and a phenomenal artist. Thomas Woodruff, I saw you somewhere. If you'd like to raise your hands, oh, there you are, right in front of me. See, Marion, you're not alone. I did that for Thomas as well today. And Dan Howe. And we have several lenders with us. I'm so grateful to you, Lynn Kircher and Carl Chait, Jane Eckert, and Sandy and George Garfunkel. We thank you immensely for contributing to this exhibition. And now I would like to introduce my colleague whose work leads the way in deepening understanding and scholarship in American illustration art, our Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Stephanie Plunkett, curator of this exhibition.
Good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful to have you with us. Just all of our friends, our wonderful artists, our lenders, we're just deeply grateful for your support. In 1948, Norman Rockwell, then in the prime of his career, took an extended leave with his family from his studio in Vermont to live in Hollywood, California, where he taught briefly at the Los Angeles County Art Institute. During a lecture that he gave at the school, which was miraculously captured on an early tape recorder and which we have in our archives, Rockwell told a story that is at the heart of our current exhibition. An inveterate traveler and art lover, he described a visit that he had made to the Chicago Art Institute, where he was apparently recognized by some young art students in the galleries. Feeling very pleased to be noticed, and he of course loved the attention that he received from his fans, he welcomed their advance to ask the question, "Are you Norman Rockwell?" When Rockwell responded in the affirmative, according to the story, one of the students replied, "Our teacher says your work stinks." On the tape, we can hear the reaction of Rockwell's audience to this tale, which was not unlike yours. People broke out in uproarious laughter. True or false, for Rockwell believed that truth should never get in the way of a good story, this self-deprecating tale is telling. In post-World War II America, the primacy of abstract art was clearly acknowledged, and by 1961, when Rockwell painted the Connoisseur, which we're fortunate to have on view, as Laurie said, his visual treatise on the subject juxtaposing Jackson Pollock's non-representational art with his own illusionistic imagery, abstract expressionism had been covered in the popular press for almost 15 years. Originated in the 1940s by Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, and others, the movement was the first American art to achieve widespread international influence. New York replaced Paris as the center of the Western art world for the first time, and though the work of the movement's main practitioners differed greatly, artists each sought points of departure from traditional and modernist painting. Expressive qualities of art were used to convey dynamism, sensuousness, violence, mystery, and lyricism, and they emphasized intuition, spontaneity, and the creative unconscious, rather than the illusionistic replication of the visible world. Rockwell earned the reputation as one of America's preeminent visual commentators and had helped forge a sense of national identity through his art, but he famously once commented that while he enjoyed receiving admiring letters from the public, "I'd love it if the critics would notice me too." That did happen at the time, but as Laurie points out, not in the way that Rockwell would have hoped. Clement Greenberg, one of the most vocal critics of the period and a champion of Pollock and the New York School, set the conversation's terms. In Greenberg's lexicon, Rockwell illustrations were kitsch, popular, accessible images that appealed to the masses. When such popular forms became the dominant taste, Greenberg argued, the high arts are challenged to flourish and survive, a danger in a society as populist and commercial as the United States. The seismic shift in the art world and its impact on the art of illustration is explored in Rockwell and Realism in the abstract world. Through the years, many prominent practitioners working across disciplines championed more expressive, symbolic, and metaphoric approaches to their work. Realist paintings evolved to reflect the new realities of a changing world, and illustration embraced the vocabularies of modernism while retaining its deep connections to visual storytelling. It has been a true honor and a pleasure to work with so many artists and collectors who really have made this exhibition possible. We are deeply grateful for their interest in the museum's work, and it's great to have so many of you with us. Thank you again. It's a great pleasure also to have I have to tell you, a couple of my former teachers here. I attended the School of Visual Arts Masters in Illustration as Visual Essay program. And Marshall was the founder and leader of that program, and Tom Woodruff was also one of the phenomenal teachers as well, and really sparked my love and appreciation, not just for the practice of illustration, but more so for establishing scholarship behind this amazing art form, really the most influential art form that we have. So it's actually now my great pleasure to introduce Marshall Arisman, who's going to say a few words. And he really is the consummate storyteller in every possible form. Crossing media and incorporating elements of symbolism, surrealism, and expressionism in his art, Marshall Arisman has been an agent for change as an image maker and visual storyteller for decades. An illustrator, painter, filmmaker, and educator, he has created artworks for virtually every national publication, including Time, U.S. News and World Report, The Nation, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, and the New York Times, and his drawings and paintings and sculptures have been exhibited throughout the world. Born in Jamestown, New York, Marshall grew up on a dairy farm and studied advertising and design at Pratt Institute. He began his career as a designer for General Motors, but became captivated by the possibilities inherent in illustration. As I said, the founder and director of the Masters in Illustration program at the School of Visual Arts, excuse me, I just lost my place. Sorry. Which is now in its 31st year. He observed that the primary issue is not whether art appears on gallery walls or in publication, but content in art is the most important thing. Frozen Images, Fitcher's Bird, The Cat Who Loved Bebop are among his illustrated books, and he is a co-author of two important books related to the field of illustration and visual storytelling, including Inside the Business of Illustration and The Education of an Illustrator, Teaching Illustration. He's recently completed an amazing new film, A Postcard from Lilydale, which is a documentary tracing the story of his grandmother, Louise Arisman, a spiritualist minister who founded a church and community in upstate New York. It's my great pleasure to welcome Marshall Arisman.
I think Tom and I take total credit for Stephanie. Dummy? It's funny, Kurt Vonnegut's last book, I think, was titled, If This Isn't Nice, Then What Is? It was a phrase his uncle used to say to him at picnics and whatever. And so I kind of think that about this show. If this isn't nice, right, then I don't really know what is, right? As Stephanie said, I grew up in a small town. I got to be careful. I'm perverse. I swear too much. I'm going to step on Norman's toes a little. My relationship to Norman Rockwell was the one I remember the most vividly was called the Prom. And I remember looking at the painting on the Saturday Evening Post thinking, God, that's exactly the way it is. And then it hit me the way it was. He did that to me all the time. My prom was full of people throwing up, and then I mean, falling down. There was no soda jerk that was kind, do you understand? But he got me every time. Every time I looked at his Thanksgiving dinner, I thought, that's the way it was. And then I remembered like Aunt Mary yelling at Aunt Ginny about the pie. At any rate, it took me a long time to, I think, appreciate Norman. I think I finally do in his full whatever. This is a complicated issue. The argument about fine arts and illustration has been going on as long as I've been around. It happens mostly among artists, primarily among illustrators. They often get heated. And I'm not sure this will shed any light on any of it, but all I can do is kind of track some of my experience. So I'm brought up in a small town in upstate New York. I apply and I'm accepted at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. It is my first time kind of off the farm and into the city. I don't think I was scared. I don't remember fear being a component. But during freshman orientation, there was a totem pole outside the dormitory. I think it was probably put there by upper fine arts students at Pratt. At the top of the totem pole, there was an abstract painting, and written on it was, "Fine arts is pure." Underneath that was a kind of funky, scratchy figure drawing, and it said, "Illustration is commercial art." Underneath that, it said, "Graphic design is not art." And underneath that, it said, "Advertising art direction is selling out." At the bottom of it was a large sign that said, "Freshmen, you are about to choose your future." Okay. I grew up reading comic books and loving illustrated children's books, and so my linkage to art school, which was the linkage of most of us there, happened in the comics and illustrated children's books. That's why we went to art school. We were figurative artists and we wanted to tell stories, basically. At that time, this is 1956, that's how old I am. I was 18, and abstract painting owned painting. There was not one figurative painting class in Pratt at that time. There were figurative drawing classes, but they lopped over into the illustration department. So I decided I would become an advertising major, and it was my first experience in becoming an art whore, which I've continued to this day. So it's curious to note that comic art was not even listed on this totem pole. Elwood, are you out there? Okay. Most of us had come to the school because of the love of drawing and storytelling. Figurative drawing was, and continues to be, the root of illustration. I took illustration electives and majored in advertising. Arguments often heated, mostly among artists, continue about illustration and fine arts. The arguments are primarily value judgments without definitions to work from. Art critics form their criticism on two fundamental aspects of art. One, the content and form of the art, and two, the intention of the artist when creating the work. I'm just trying to get some ground rules here so we don't argue about this. Fine art, according to Wikipedia, is art created by an artist who owns the content and form and intends to create art for aesthetics or beauty. What do you think? No good? Okay. Illustration, again, according to Wikipedia, is art created by an artist that serves some practical function, an applied art, a decorative interpretation, or a visual explanation of a text by a writer. This element is crucial here. Right? To quote Norman Rockwell, many who consider themselves serious painters look down their noses at us. We paint for money, against deadlines, our subject matter often prescribed by an editor or an author. In 1979, Robert Weaver, he has a piece in the show, The Undisputed pioneer of contemporary illustration, was asked if illustration was art. What do you think he said, Stephanie? He replied, no. It is only a profession whose best practitioners may one day be remembered as artists. The state of the art of illustration might be compared to a third world country. It has not yet gained control of its technology. Editors and design consultants, not artists, shape the magazine. Writers continue to control the content. For a work to be judged as art, there must be an artist in full command of his medium. Interesting point. Only when he has pushed it as far as it can go can he be fairly tested by the same critical standards applied to other artists. In 1960, I was a senior at Pratt Institute, and a lot of abstract painters came to talk. De Kooning, Rothko, Klein. And then they said David Smith was coming. David Smith, America's preeminent painter-sculptor, was one of my favorite artists. So playing teacher's pet, I asked if I could go meet Mr. Smith at the gate and bring him to the class. I was not prepared for this very large man who was wearing overalls over a work shirt, had on steel-tipped shoes, and looked like he had his pipe spot welded to his lip, okay? And I said, Mr. Smith, I'm here to accompany you to the classroom. As we were walking, he turned to me and he said, I'm going to smoke in there. I said, Mr. Smith, you can do anything you want in there. Okay? We are lined up in the classroom with all of our work. I mean, our assumption is that wonderful, famous artist is going to judge, value, and hopefully love what we've been doing. He comes into the room, we're all sitting there with our work. He walks to the front of the room, he sits down, and he says, whether you like one of my pieces of art over another does not interest me. Whether I like one of your pieces of art over another shouldn't interest you. What should interest all of us are the stories behind the art. We then spent the next 6 hours in his favorite bar in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, drinking beer and explaining to each other. And you have to remember that this group of people covered abstract painters and illustrators and whatever we were, and telling each other what our intent was, what we thought the content of what we were doing was, and what form it took, whether we were painting it or sculpting it or whatever. At one point, I remember holding up figure drawings and showing sketchbooks and announcing that I was going to be a storyteller. At that point, one of my fellow classmates who was an abstract painter said, you are an illustrator. That was a value judgment. That value judgment continues till today, right? Art criticism is always a form of intervention, a seeming educated evaluation that floats between a work of art and its public, often influencing the experience of looking, and sometimes a judgment that obscures seeing. When art critics want to diminish the work of a figurative painter, they refer to it as illustration or illustrative. Almost every review I've ever read of Andrew Wyeth's work condemns him for being too illustrative. That has also been said about Francis Bacon, Lucian Freud, and Edward Hopper. Every gallery director of every gallery with whom I've ever had an exhibition with has said to me at one point or the other, You have to stop doing illustration. It is killing your fine art career. People come into the gallery and say, yeah, I know this guy's illustration. I had no idea he was a serious artist. So whether we like it or not, these signposts are up there and they exist, right? Clearly a value judgment. Illustration is the lesser art, and doing it interferes with the perception of being a true artist. When I explain that no art director or editors ever tried to control the content or form of the work I do, gallery directors look back at me blankly. Clearly, they did not know the definition of illustration, nor did they care. If an image turns up on a printed page, not a gallery wall, it's illustration. Ta-da. Right, Jim? Okay. When Norman Rockwell was asked if he thought of himself as a fine artist, he said, "Some people have been kind enough to call me a fine artist. I've always called myself an illustrator. I'm not sure what the difference is." Rockwell's statement throws some light on how he perceived himself and his art. Theoretically, fine artists have complete control over both the form and content of their work. Rockwell was the exception. As the artist whose original painting showed up every week on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, he was defined as an illustrator. But like it or not, see it as high art or low art, Rockwell's vision of America can be judged for the same criteria as fine art. We can argue whether the Post chose Rockwell because his vision closely matched the magazine's editorial policy, or whether they just liked his paintings. At any rate, Rockwell painted what he wanted to paint the way he wanted to paint it, like any fine artist. The only difference was they were reproduced on the covers of a cinema magazine reaching hundreds and thousands of viewers. My point here is that Rockwell did control its content. This was not the Saturday Evening Post telling this man what to do. This was his vision. If that's the definition of fine art, then he deservedly should be judged into the middle of it. I have a bad story, but I'm going to leave it out. There are children here. I don't. Okay. No, I have a story about John Kennedy, but anyway. Well, it's not that bad. I met John Kennedy at an art. I apologize before I say it. Now I'm going to say it. I met John Kennedy at a cocktail party. I was aware that John Kennedy was he was supposed to be a genius kid artist. Right? He had all this amazing ability. And we're talking, and I've not yet told him I illustrate. Does that make sense? I mean, and we were talking about art and fine art. And he said to me, "Have you been to the Louvre yet?" And I said, "Yeah, actually I have." He said, "You know, the first time I went to the Louvre, I got an erection." That may be the most esoteric thing anyone has ever said to me. You understand? I thought, who is this man? And what is I thought. Anyway. By 1950, the expansion of magazines like Psychology Today, Esquire, and others demanded of the artist a more conceptual approach to the illustration of the articles. In many cases, the text had moved from narrative storytelling to psychological profiles. A small group of artists, including Robert Weaver, Milton Glaser, Seymour Quast, and others, became graphic commentators and began assuming more control over the content of their images. If you look at the Robert Weaver in the exhibition, that is a very complicated image. And the images were going with very complicated stories. We were suddenly talking about schizophrenia and not about whatever it was. A door opened in illustration in the late 60s. the op-ed page of the New York Times, under the art direction of J.C. Suarez and a group of enlightened editors, including David Schneiderman, the content of the art was left to the artist. This was an incredible period, unheard of in illustration, I think. Suarez called on a few international artists that included myself, Brad Holland, Topor, Fallon, and others to work with him. Many images we had done for ourselves were printed with articles that the editors felt related to our pictures. This was the first time that we were all bringing in existing artwork we had done for us, and they were saying, great, we'll find an article that fits it. And there were a 2-year period when it was fun to look at the page. It was surprising. A drawing I had done of a man being tortured, I did a lot of torture drawings, ran with an article titled Tortures Teachers. The text was a true story of an ex-CIA agent who taught torture techniques, why am I laughing, to the South American police. The morning the New York Times came out, there was a knock on my door. There was a very large man standing there in a green beret with the New York Times in his fist. And he said to me, you are an artist, you did this really violent portrait of my best friend. I am here to beat the shit out of you. And I looked at him, and in hopes of avoiding what was going to be a serious beating, I invited him in. We went in, we sat down and had coffee, and I said to him, let me explain something to you. The content of the article is not mine. The content of the article was written by a writer. The editor of the New York Times op-ed page, which at that time was Charlotte Curtis, accepted this as truth, found a drawing I had already done of somebody torturing somebody, and if you really want to beat the shit out of somebody, we should look for Charlotte Curtis. I actually was surprised when he got up and said, let's go. Okay? We actually went out, got into a cab, and got to the front of the New York Times building before he backed off. Said, you know, if I do, I'm going to jail. If I die, and he walked down the street. I took the time to go upstairs into Charlotte's office and say, you know, Charlotte, you came this close to getting your ass whipped. So if you think images don't have any power, you're wrong. I mean, it's weird as an illustrator because you do this alone. It never occurs to me that this is looked at by hundreds of people. Does that make sense? I mean, and so the responses are always curious because they remind you that there is some kind of communication going on in this storytelling. And I've had many too many responses, death threats. I'll tell you one. I get a letter from I was asked, I did a lot of work for the Crotch magazines. I'm not proud of it, but Penthouse and Playboy used a lot of good art, right? And the articles were supposed to be interesting. Wasn't that the hype? Anyway. So Penthouse asked me to do a portrait of a guy who had 6 personalities. One of them painted. He was actually a good painter. But one of them killed him. Not good. Okay. And they said, we don't care if it looks like him. Do something weird. Okay. I did this painting of a bird, strange bird, kind of half human, half crouched, whatever it was. And it rained. And I get a letter from this guy who says, I saw the vicious portrait you did of me. It is taped over my cell bunk. It is the first image I see every morning, the last thing I see every night. And when I get out of here, I intend to, and if this is true, it looks like he shifted hands at this point. I intend to, and then scrawled, it said, peel your ass. Okay. I spent the next month walking down the street expecting a man with a giant potato peel walking at me. Okay. Then he went on to say, you leave your apartment on 100th Street approximately 8:30, you walk to Broadway, whatever, you get a single espresso. You never take sugar, you like the whatever. Went on, tracked my whole day. I take the letter to the police. And I say, hey, I got this letter. It's a threat. And the cop reads it, and he said, his buddy's following you. I said, yeah, I know. That's why I'm here. And he said, anybody hurt you yet? I said, not yet. He said, when they do, come back. Anyway, we won't. I'm going to stop that. Okay. My lad, I got a letter from I got a phone call, 80-year-old coal miner who said to me, I'm getting a haircut today. I'm 80 years old. I'm reading a Playboy in the barbershop. I've never seen my name in print before. I said, what? He said, my name. I've never seen it printed in print. I said, your name is Marshall Earthman? Yeah. Spelled A-R, yeah, that's the way I spell my name. Turned out my mother got in touch with his daughter. We were related. Okay. So he says to me, I'm rambling. Okay. He said to me, I'm looking for my brother Frank. You've never run into him, have you? And the weird thing was, a year before that, in the New York phone book was listed a Frank Earthman. I'm always the only A-R-I-S in the phone book. I noticed it. I thought I could, whoa, should I call Frank? Then I thought, are you crazy? I never called Frank. Okay, Frank disappears. I said, it could have been him. I don't know. I never called him. He never got in touch. I'm at a cocktail party in New York, in the Village. I'm talking to a banker from Citibank who looks like my father. And I'm looking at this guy and thinking, God, this guy looks like my dad. And at the end of it, he gave me his card, Frank Earthman. And I said, my God, this is amazing. I got this call. He said, I'm not the Frank, but I know where he is. Because my father is a freak, a family tree freak. Gave me his name, his address. He lived in Denver. I called Marshall. They got together. Nice story, right? Nice story, okay. Now I'll give you a sad story, right? Duchamp said, the artist only does half the job. Viewer completes the picture by bringing to bear their insight, intuition, and life experience. Mark Rothko, who insisted that he was not an abstractionist, said, this is a scary quote, a picture lives by companionship, expanding and quickening in the eyes of the sensitive observer. It dies by the same token. You know how scary that thought is? Okay. It is therefore risky to send it out into the world. This is Mark Rothko. How often it must be impaired by the unfeeling and the cruelty of the impotent. Rothko thought he was a channel. Rothko thought that what came through him, he didn't like to talk about this, lived on the canvas, that these were living things, like plants. And if insensitive people looked at them too long, they died. I get this visual of poor Rothko being invited to numerous rich people's houses, having dinner with them, and realizing how insensitive these people were, and that his painting was dying. Okay. This may be a reason that Mark Rothko committed suicide, On February 25th, 1970, a cop in my Army Reserve unit in New York found his body. So I'm in an Army Reserve unit. This guy, cop, comes up to me and said, "You're an artist." "I'm the cop who found Rothko's body." I said, "Rothko? You found Mark Rothko's body?" He said, "Yeah, me and my partner." He said, "We walked in, knew it was a male suicide." I said, "Really? How?" He said, "Because he had Band-Aids around both his fingers." He said, "Only old guys do that. They Band-Aid their fingers before they cut their wrists and their arms." Strange, no? Okay, it's dangerous out there. Okay. He said, "You're an artist. Tell me why those large canvases," and I won't say the bad word he said, "of dark squares are worth $40,000. That was 1970. In 2013, a Rothko painting brought $86 million at auction. That same year, it's already been mentioned, Norman Rockwell's painting titled Saying Grace brought $46 million at auction. The collectors of Rockwell's paintings are interested in storytelling as an art form. They include Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, who both tell stories on film. "When you look at a Rockwell painting, you see yourself," said George Lucas. It's a nice quote, no? Rockwell clearly understood this when he painted the Connoisseur, the cornerstone of this exhibition. We see the back of a man, probably a banker in a suit, standing before a Jackson Pollock-like drip painting. It's funny about that painting because de Kooning said when he looked at that Rockwell's imitation of Pollock, that inch by inch it was as good as a Pollock, if not better. Okay, so we see the back of this guy. Without being able to see his face, Rockwell gives us no clue, which he rarely did, right, to what the man is thinking. We are left to consider the question ourselves, is this art? When asked what the lay viewer should look for in his paintings, Pollock said, "I think they should look, not for, but to look passively. The painting should be enjoyed just as music is enjoyed." Talk about different worlds here. Does that make sense? The American critic, Clement Greenberg, whose name has already come up, said Jackson's work should be called action painting. The essence of the work is not what you see, but what the painter does. And indeed, ironically, there are more photographs of Jackson Pollock painting than there are photographs of his work. I mean, when I think of Jackson Pollock, I think about that photo. Doesn't that, anyway, okay. There are a few photographs of Rockwell painting, not many. My favorite, and the one I'll always bless him for, is in one of his books. There's a photograph of Norman Rockwell with a projector behind him, projecting a photograph onto the canvas, and he's tracing. No artist I know would do that. I mean, illustrators are famous for having tracing machines all hidden in the back. It's like every illustrator I know, I'd say, you know, "Hey, Mac, you got a lucograph?" We called them lucograph. "Yeah, I got one. I never use it." I mean, where is it? This gets into funny territory. If you come to my studio, I always have a piece of photo reference on the wall. Paintings have to start somewhere, right? I don't have a photographic memory. So if I'm going to paint a frog, I have a photograph of the frog. I put it up there and I start the frog. If you come to see me, I take the photograph down. Understand? I'm as guilty as every other artist. Does that make sense? I'm trying to mystify this thing. Does that make sense? When I stand in front of a Pollock painting, I enjoy watching its line dance. When I stand in front of a Rockwell painting, I enjoy his art of storytelling. Whether Pollock's work is more serious or artistic than Rockwell's is not for me to decide. that they are both fine artists by the considered definition of a fine artist clear. Each one alone determine the content and form of their art. The form of current art and art criticism today is brought about by pluralism. There is no consensus anymore. There is no representative style of this age. I don't think that's a value judgment. It's the way it is. Every lane on the artistic highway is filled to capacity with multiple content and forms of expression. Storytelling is not dead. It has become one of many choices open for the illustrator and figurative painter. Personally, I consider storytelling important. In 1984, as Stephanie mentioned, I started a graduate program called Illustration as Visual Essay. The idea was to try to educate figurative artists in the art of storytelling. The basis of the idea is that the content is them. If you can take yourself as content, find a form to express it, why not? Right? Not a bad thing to do, right? In my own work, I try to find stories I believe are worth telling. My form includes paintings, drawings, sculpture, film, whatever I have the energy for on any one day. The content is mine, whether dumb or funny or dealing with serious cultural, political ideas. Does that make me a fine artist? By definition, yes, but I like the word illustrator. It suits my vision of the world. To quote John Berger, I have come to see that the arranging of artists in a hierarchy of merit is an idle and essentially dilettante process. What matters are the needs which art answers. We're on slippery ground again, okay? During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, artists filled a common need in society. Painting, sculpture, frescoes, bas-reliefs served as visual aids to help illiterate citizens understand the stories from the Bible. The artists were respected for doing God's work. The patron, of course, was the church. Through the centuries, with the invention of the printing press and photography and education becoming more widespread, other art forms like theater, dance, music, and later film began to tell the stories of their times to a variety of different audiences whose experience and interests were no longer the same. The audiences shifted focus as well, and is more so today. Art is expected, seemingly, to serve many purposes: entertainment, storytelling, propaganda, meditation, maybe to shock, to comfort, or to simply make the artist rich and famous and supply the art market and auction houses with products to sell. Art deemed important continues to be made, but in an environment of anything goes. The critical responses are as desperate as the art. And despite the fact that more people are going to museums than ever before, art continues to be in danger, it's my opinion, of losing its connection to the community at large. I'll give you a personal example. I had an exhibition in the gallery, and my favorite jazz station coming out of Newark wanted to do a fundraiser. So the gallery director said, "Do you mind if we have a fundraiser? Your show's up." I said, "No, are you kidding? I love that statement." Anyway, they brought in a piano, they had an opening, and sitting at the piano was an 80-year-old African-American who was incredible. And during the break, I went over to him and I said, "Who are you, man? I mean, you are somebody. Who are you?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I played with some people." And I said, "Like who?" "Well, Lester Young, Sonny Stitt." I said, "Right." He said, "I've never been in a gallery before." And I said, "What are you talking about? You're born and raised in New York. You went to Juilliard. You're educated. I mean, you've never been in a gallery before?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why?" He said, "I walk by a lot of galleries, and I look in the window, and I see stuff I don't understand. I see bricks in a corner. I see things hanging off the ceiling. He said, it makes me feel stupid that I don't understand what I'm looking at and I don't want to go in. If that starts happening over and over again, does that make sense? Then art as a community, whatever it is, right, begins to serve no purpose except the ego or the marketplace or something. Okay, I'm almost done. Okay, I mean, John Steinbeck's nice quote, "We are lonesome animals. We spend all our life trying to be less lonesome. One of our ancient methods is to tell a story begging the listener to say and to feel, yes, that's the way it is, or at least that's the way I feel it. You are not as alone as you thought." My last comment is that in my neighborhood, 3 blocks away from my apartment, a new street sign has just been mounted. Right? West 103rd Street, between Broadway and Amsterdam Avenues, is now Norman Rockwell Place. How this happened is a real Rockwell story. We need these stories. 2 years ago, a group of high school students in the neighborhood visited this museum. They were very impressed. They went home. They learned that Rockwell, in fact, had been born a block away from their high school. They got a petition together. They went out into the community. They got over 500 people to sign it. And the city agreed to name 103rd Street after him. Last week, this is true, I asked a 10-year-old standing on Norman Rockwell Place if he knew who Norman Rockwell was. Not a clue, he said. Okay. He was an illustrator, I said. Whatever, he said, and walked away. Okay. A plaque will be placed on the building very soon. My hope is that it will say what an illustrator is. That's all I got to say.